Okay, very warm welcome everyone to this session of Lights Please, providing energy services in fragile and conflict areas. We have a very first session in the Fragility Forum on energy that Morgan, who's sitting in the background, and I tried to put together, and a very distinguished panel today. Julia Bucknell on the left, Practice Manager, South Asia Energy. Chaz Feinstein, who is the Global Practice Director for Energy and Extractives. We have Mike van Ginneken, who is our Practice Manager for West Africa and Energy. We have Bob Saum, who is the Country Director for Afghanistan. And we have Kathleen Reedy, who is an anthropologist with the RAND Corporation. So thank you very much, everyone, for accepting to be on this panel today. Now, as we talk about fragile states and energy, the biggest challenge is that simply energy infrastructure is lacking and partially crippled or simply not there and available. So the question then becomes, what do we do, and can we do anything? And how should we engage? When I, many years ago, met with the advisor to the president in Liberia and asked him what his approach was, he said, well, there is this poet, Antonio Machado, who brought me this poem, which is, traveler, there is no road. We make the road while walking. And indeed, the energy, theory doesn't provide us with ready-made solutions on how we can intervene in fragile states. But as we have started working more in this area, we have gathered some experience, and we hope and trust that the people on the panel will be able to shed some light on this today. So the format is that everyone on the panel will be asked a question and will, expand a little bit on those questions, and then we open it up for questions. Let me start with Bob. Bob has been 4 years country director in Afghanistan, and before that has lived and worked in fragile states, including Pakistan, Zimbabwe, Kenya, and East Jerusalem. Bob, my question to you, can we make a difference on the ground in, improving energy infrastructure in fragile state? Does it work at all, given the many other complex issues we are facing in those states anyway?
So can I just answer that with a yes, and then we move on? Or you want more? I think you probably want more than that, right? So good morning, everyone. It's nice to be here today. And as Fanny mentioned, this is the first session over the years in fiduciary in the Fragility Forums on energy, and I actually think this is a great opportunity because as a country director for the World Bank in a place like Afghanistan, what we see is that these very core issues that get the economy going, that get services to the people, that address poverty, address the jobs issues are essential. And to the question that Fanny posed, can we do it? Yes, but there's a whole lot of buts, right? But you have to know what you're doing. You have to be aware of your surroundings. You have to be aware of the political economy issues. You have to be aware of many things. But it's essential that we and other partners are in this space to help our countries and the people there do that. So just a few comments from me, and then I want to end up with some questions that I'll try to start some answers on. Just briefly on Afghanistan, many of you, I think, will be familiar that Afghanistan is still in the midst of 3 decades of conflict. We used to be able to say was emerging from conflict, but I think at this point we would still say that it's still within conflict. Extremely fragile politically, economically, and security-wise. Poverty remains quite high, was 36% for extreme poverty, rising up at least to 39% now. And when we look at this in the energy access issues, Right now, it's about 25 to 30% of Afghans have access to electricity, compared to 6% in 2002. So on one hand, I think your question has been answered, is can we? Yes, we can. And the Afghans have done a significant amount. But we all know that 25 to 30% is not what one aspires to, right? And that's, it's a point in the progress as we move forward, but it needs to be much higher. The reasons for that are the reasons I think we all know well, from having the ability for girls to be able to study at home at night with electricity, to small businesses, to increasingly communication. Everybody wants to be able to charge their cell phone, right? And that includes in Afghanistan as well, in rural areas, to small businesses, to major industry. In a place like Afghanistan, where natural resources will be a major part of the growth framework going forward, the lack of infrastructure, including the lack of electricity, is one of the major constraints there. So the three questions I wanted to ask, the first one is, so with all that background, what are the challenges that countries actually face in getting the necessary energy that they and their citizens want? And when I've thought about this, many of the issues are essentially the same as other developing countries that are trying to increase their energy, but the issues face particular constraints and considerations when you're in a country like Afghanistan. One of the interesting aspects is, when we're looking at this, is balancing generation with import of electricity. Now, yes, every country in the world has to balance this, right? But when you're in a fragile country like Afghanistan, in a neighborhood where there is fragility in your neighbors, part of the fragility arises from relations with the neighbors, this question of generating your own electricity or importing takes on added significance. And so this is what they struggle with. Even though they can import power from Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, as we found out in the past weeks, that power can easily be cut off as well when they're in the midst of an energy crisis, right? Due to a conflict, fighting in an area, the main pylons for the lines supporting Kabul were blown up, right? And they switched over to the power from Tajikistan, or Tajikistan, and then eventually that was cut off as well. So one needs to look at these issues through the lens of fragility in the political economy, and it's not just merely a technical solution. The next challenge our countries face are that citizens want to see results, especially in a place like Afghanistan, where there's been billions of dollars put in by the international community, by the government itself, and improving their lives. To help to get over this fragility, they really do need to see some success. And as I mentioned earlier, whether it's girls being able to study at night, whether it's people in the rural areas being able to charge their cell phones, to be in contact, whatever it may be. The third challenge they face is general lack of capacity. And I use this all-encompassing, from the financial means to have financial resources to invest in the energy sector, to the technical know-how, engineers, electrical engineers, managers, financial managers, all of these basic areas of capacity, the institutional issues that are necessary, that are useful to move things forward. And finally, I think the last challenge they face are the political economy issues on who gets power within the country, right? So when you're in a country with fragility, just because you might be able to install a line here because it's technically easy, or get this hydro plant running, but if that's going to put more energy and more power in this ethnic group, this geographic area, and another part of the country is going to be have further time without power, and the difference is being exaggerated, they need to consider this, right? Then the second question is, so what can partners do in supporting countries to get this energy? Firstly, I think we need broad-based responses that combine micro and household solutions, right, through various avenues. In Afghanistan, you have the National Solidarity Program that has done supported a lot of micro solutions, and balancing that with on-grid solutions. Secondly, is that we need to provide the best technical advice in the world. We don't need generalists. We don't need people who just want to come in and sort of help generally getting things along. they need the best technical advice on energy in the world. So how is it that they're going to leap forward? What's the most relevant technical solution of the moment? We also need to understand the political and security situations, as I was describing. And I think the fourth thing that we need to do is that we need to be patient in our listening and listen and observe, but we need to push our own readiness so when the moment is right, and Fanny asked the question of can we do something, we're ready to do something. And that's a constant challenge between listening and being patient, but being fully ready to jump and support the client when we can. And so what increases these chances of success so we actually can say yes, that we can do this? And I think we have to be very clear that success here is turning on the lights, right? And we'd be very back to what is it that citizens want and that they need to see results. We need to be present with the client. Now, for an institution like the World Bank, for other international partners, that means a physical presence in country that brings significant costs, brings significant security considerations, loss of life, unfortunately, as we have seen. But that being present means we need to have the right technical skills available at the right time. We need to be able to look at regional considerations. In Afghanistan, we have the CASA 1000 that's bringing power from Central Asia through Afghanistan to Pakistan. Regional considerations are very important, but need to also be looked at in the political economy aspects. We have to take risks if we want to increase the chances of success. We've done that in Afghanistan, I think, on a regular basis for whether it's on CASA 1000, and this is a project that's taken 8, 9 years, right? Something like that, but you got to stay with it, right? For those of you who are from the World Bank Group, internally we also need to take risks when we have management talking about, well, this project hasn't dispersed, so we need to stop this project or something. And Julia knows, and Fanny knows, last summer we had a project, apologies for those not in the World Bank, but purely internal, where for 2 years it's a problem project. It was horrible, right? But it needed to be finished. And we are making sure that it's going to get finished, right? And you get every exception in the book, but you got to do it. So you got to take these risks. On the institutional part, I think what we can do to increase our chances of success is not be sequential. Yes, institutions are absolutely essential and critical, but we can't wait till we have all the institutions in place and then come in with actually turning the lights on. So that's going to vary by country how you work on those in parallel. And then, as I mentioned, we need to have the best technical people available. We need to look at leaping forward, not just seeing what's easiest and what's readily available. And finally, we need to do analytical work. And this is something where we work closely with the Asian Development Bank in Afghanistan, where they've done the overall master plan. We're embarking on work now on a roadmap on renewable energies for Afghanistan. We're looking at the geospatial analysis of electrification requirements. There's a whole lot of analytical work, and I think that's where international partners can come in as well to do that. So the conclusion for me is the same as I started. Yes, we can.
Well, thanks for that encouraging, encouraging note. Julia Bucknell is, as I said, the practice manager in South Asia's energy department, and she's worked in the World Bank for 20 years, working across sectors, water, transport, and energy, and also in a wide range of fragile states. Julia, we've heard from Bob that one of the key components for working in fragile states is capacity. And the capacity to deliver also within the country. Now, we know that in many of the countries that we work in, these institutional structures is simply not there. How do we work with those governments? How do we engage, especially on energy issues?
Patiently. I think we all know that the countries that need us most can use us least. And I think that's one of the sort of challenges of development in general. And in fragile states, it's all the more urgent, I think. so everything's harder, right? I mean, everything takes longer, and there's more external people doing things and influencing things, and the government's capacity to push back against help that it doesn't want or help that's going in a direction it doesn't want is lower. And so I think always remembering that the client is in the lead, even when they're actually not leading, but kind of putting them into that leadership role and remembering that we're always behind them, and trying to remember that the whole donor community is behind them, I think is an important part of it. I wanted to talk a little bit about the effects of of fragility on the legitimacy of the state. I think it depends whether you've got what kind of conflict or what kind of fragility you've got. But in many countries, especially after you've had something like a civil war, where it's actually a conflict between certain groups within the country and the government that became in power after the end of it, those wounds don't go away, those wounds stay there. And sometimes our projects can become instruments in that long-standing trauma. And we sort of have to recognize that we are part of a completely different story. Like, we think our job is just to put the lights on, but as far as many other different competing interests go, actually our job is to have redress mechanisms and grievance mechanisms and to help people engage with their government. And the objective that we come in with, which is putting the lights on, is very secondary. And what it means for us practically is that it means that we're under the microscope in terms of procedures. And any tiny slip-up, however unimportant sounding, I know he's laughing because he knows what I'm about to talk about, because he's from that village. Any tiny slip-up that may sound not important or material to the problem at hand, such as the date in which something was put on a website in the right language, or things that don't seem like they should matter in terms of getting a power line constructed or a power station built, those can be an instrument in a secondary grievance, a grievance that goes back years and decades and has a history that outsiders can't understand. And so our redress mechanisms are sometimes used to help people gain legitimacy in their own battle. And so it makes it all the more important that we follow these very minute procedures so that we don't worsen the situation and keep things going on for longer and longer and longer. So I think that's one lesson that I've drawn in the last few years, is that legitimacy matters a lot. The second thing I wanted to say is that when I was in graduate school, yay so many years ago, we talked a lot about leapfrogging. There was always this idea that countries would leapfrog, and and you do think in a country which has got 30% electricity connections, that off-grid must be the solution, because that's the future and the grid is the thing of the past, and why don't we go straight to the new future? Sadly, it's not. It doesn't seem to be as easy as that. I wish it were. And the lesson that I think, at least I've drawn from a few years of off-grid solutions outside of, not in fragile countries, but is that the community business and the kind of constant reinforcement of a unified community matters a lot to having a successful off-grid solution, because you don't have a central agency kind of giving you power. You have to kind of make and manage it yourselves as a community. And that's sometimes hard. It's harder in fragile countries, and it's certainly harder for us to evaluate influence and change. So I think it is good for us to think of this famous leapfrogging thing, but I don't think it's any easier. So I think what Bob said about the mix between kind of the old and the new is actually very important to continue with. So I think I'll stop there with just sort of the basic story is that it's all possible, but it all takes longer and requires us to up our game and be better than we would otherwise be.
Thank you very much, Julia. Let me now turn to Kathleen Reedy. Kathleen is an anthropologist at the RAND Corporation, where she focuses on Middle Eastern culture and politics. She's also worked for the U.S. Army in Afghanistan and Iraq. We were talking about institutional structures, governance that makes projects feasible. But as Bob mentioned, there's also these issues on the ground that happen, like the transmission line in Afghanistan that was blown up recently, and that led to continuous and ongoing power outages today in Kabul. How does one prevent these things from happening? Can one organize people so they support the infrastructure rather than blowing it up?
And we'll do world peace next. Not easily, but it is doable. I think it's about, we sort of talked about this a little bit, about going local, right? Really understanding sort of local needs, understanding if you're in a fragile state versus a conflict state, right? Those are two very different spaces, and what they mean and the costs associated with them can be very different, and how you kind of generate group consent, especially at small levels. Also, though, we're talking about rural versus urban populations, and what that means. Those are again, sort of very broad differences there in terms of how you need to generate sort of community engagement and involvement, and really to get that buy-in, right? Because this is really what we're driving at here is how to get buy-in, and I think there's a study that I think small distributed sort of electricity sources are something like 5 times less vulnerable to attack than sort of major infrastructure. And a lot of that is, because it's visible, right? To hit a bunch of small little microgrids is not nearly going to have the same impact as hitting one very big visible target. So some of it is about, even before you're kind of thinking about the community, is thinking about, are we in a conflict zone where we're looking at people who are attempting to disrupt that legitimacy of the government, and are they doing so via taking out infrastructure? And then, what are the costs associated with going big infrastructure right now when it's still in conflict state, versus going a little bit more distributed, going local, thinking about, okay, how do we do, these kind of off-grid solutions in moments like that, and then think about, 10 years down the road when perhaps they're no longer in conflict and are just fragile, as terrible as that sounds, and then, then you start to think big picture. And I think then it's a matter of selling to local communities, because we did see when we were in Afghanistan, I was very much out on the ground in very rural, mountainous locations. And the only things that ever succeeded were these little tiny community engagement projects, where you had this kind of local buy-in, where you had people who were willing to stand up and defend it and own it and take care of it. That gets challenging in the energy realm, though, because that requires expertise that a lot of times you just don't have for maintenance and all these kinds of things. It also sometimes getting two communities together, again, you run into problems of, well, why do they have this, but I don't have this? Did we actually talk to the right community elders, or did we get sort of the wool pulled over our eyes again? But I think it just takes time. And it takes a willingness to really engage at that local level, to really go down and look at the particulars of what works where. We have, in Rwanda, there's the program where they're giving everyone solar-powered LED lights, and you have to buy them as individuals, but you can have them in your home, and it's just, talk about very off the grid. But it's been a really big success because it's not even community-based, right? It's individual household-based. And sort of that's what in these really remote communities has given them more light, more time to do schoolwork, time to keep your businesses open a little bit later. So trying to kind of find, well, that solution there works very well. Where do you step up a little bigger? Where do you step up a little bit bigger? And to start thinking big-term infrastructure projects. So I think, I'm an anthropologist, right? Go local is what I do. So I think that would be sort of my answer is really, you've got to be there, you've got to be on the ground to see what is really going to work where in which situation.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. Let's now turn to Chaz Feinstein. Chaz is Director of the Energy and Extractives practice, and he's been in leading positions in the energy sector in East Asia and Pacific, ECA and LAC, and has over 25 years experience at the bank, and previously worked for UNDP. Well, taking all these comments from previous panelists together, and also looking at the experience that the World Bank has gained over the last few years by working in more fragile environments in the energy sector, Chaz, do you think there is sort of an emerging practice of knowledge or lessons learned that we can bring to the table for working in fragile states?
So this being a political year and today being Super Tuesday, I'm going to pull the politician's prerogative. I'll talk about what I want to talk about, not what you just asked me. First, I do want to give the impression that energy in FCS is a pretty big deal for the World Bank. In fact, I took the list on the internet of all at least the 2014 definition of FCS. And of that long list, I find that there's only about half a dozen countries where we don't have a major energy program. Chad, Eritrea, Libya, Marshall Islands, Somalia, South Sudan, and Sudan. Oh, excuse me. We just shrunk. In most of the countries where we don't have an energy program, it's because we don't really have a program at all or just due to security concerns. So energy is a very important aspect of our work in FCS. Now, having said that, I first want to address a population that we don't often reach, and it's a little bit in line with, I think, Kathleen's comments, and that is refugees and DPs, displaced populations, are a very big deal and particularly now with the global consciousness. And you look at the energy situation of DPs, and it's simple. It's displaced people are the energy displaced. They don't have access to modern energy. They're not typically targeted by all the various global programs, such as Sustainable Energy for All. They're sort of forgotten in that equation. And there's many good reasons for that, but just to talk a little bit more about their plight. Typically, displaced people, first off, their number one energy priority is not necessarily light. It's cooking. And for that, they use firewood and charcoal, which we now know has got some very deleterious, impactful, it's very bad for public health. I mean, I'm fond of quoting the statistic. 4.3 million people a year die from exposure to smoke from using poor quality biomass fuels. Roughly 2.5 billion people on the planet are dependent on these fuels, including the displaced. And one alternative that's typically given is kerosene, which isn't a great solution. It's dangerous, and it's also very smoky. And so what can you do for these people? Well, basically improve cook stoves, perhaps bottled gas for lighting solutions like Kathleen mentioned, just some very basic, for example, solar lantern appliances. Now, why do we see typically that these kinds of measures are not very often mounted in refugee camps or situations where you have displaced populations, even though it would reduce costs of energy service, cut emissions, and save lives? It's interesting, and Mac has led some of this fact-finding or conclusions. First, we find that there's a general lack of expertise in energy solutions when planning humanitarian efforts. It's just typically not thought of or not very high on humanitarian assistance programs definition. Second, the very nature of these efforts are typically short-term oriented, and the fact is that implementing infrastructure solutions and energy solutions typically requires fairly long-term planning. In fact, there's the sort of reverse assumption that if these people are displaced and transitory, let's not make any real investment in long-term solutions because you sort of hope that they go away, right? And then, interestingly, the basic model of service provision is what we term procure and provide. So in other words, provide a flow finance, procure through public entities, and then the public entity provides, in this case, the energy service. But actually, in most of our lives, we find that some sort of partnership with private sector is typically the more sustainable, more efficient service delivery means. But if you've got a public procurement kind of service model, those people are often dealt out. So I guess my first point here is that while we're active in many, many countries, we're not so much effective, and agencies who are dealing with displaced populations in at least even at a basic level solving the energy problem for the DPs. My second observation is, again, in line, I think, with both what Julia and Kathleen said, and that is the whole concept of energy planning in conflict environments has to take into account the whole problem of resiliency. And, you know, there's some interesting parallels, actually, to the internet. Why was the internet created? Anybody know? Yeah, it was the U.S. military. They were concerned with the problem of C3, communications, command, and control in the event of nuclear war. So typically in communication theory, if I want to talk to Mac, I put a wire between me and Mac, and we send data. The problem with that is if that wire breaks, we no longer talk to each other. So DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Program of the U.S. government, the U.S. military, they figured out what's now known as packet switched networks. So data is broken up into little pieces and large amount of redundancy. It's set through all sorts of wires and reassembled by the time it reaches MAC. And even if one pathway is blown up, then another pathway will survive and the message can still be received. There's a parallel to, and I think Kathleen was hinting at this, that as we would get more serious about distributed energy, I'm not sure if it's leapfrogging, who's going to follow and who's going to lead, but eventually fragile states are going to be a big beneficiary of the growth of distributed energy and distributed generation. And why, again, for the exact reason why the internet was originally created, because the resiliency that will provide. So that didn't answer your question, but there you go.
Let me then try and ask another question, see whether I get an answer. But good luck. Michael van Ginneken is the practice manager for West Africa, for Energy West Africa, and soon to be the practice manager for water in South Asia. And she has over 10 years at the bank, maybe 15 years, working in fragile states and also living in fragile states. CAR and Cameroon are two countries that come to mind. Since you're working both on water and energy, you know, you could argue water is life, but what is energy? It's maybe much less life. But can one work on water and energy issues jointly to bring about more power for fragile states? And how has that worked in your experience?
Working on water and energy combined is very dangerous, huh? You have a high risk of electrocution, so I'm not sure in how far. And that's the part that answers your question. Then let me pull a chas on Super Tuesday. I just wanted to start with actually giving a little bit of granularity on fragile and conflict situations. No, I mean, there's quite a lot of discussion on the Afghanistan situation because there's a little bit of a bias in this panel. Just wanted to kind of, you know, it's interesting, this kind of blowing up infrastructure in most of the fragile states in Africa that I work on. That's not the driver for solutions. And I work on 26 countries. I haven't checked Chas's list, but I think more than half, probably 15 or 18 of those are considered fragile. What is our reality? Couple of pointers. First of all, I think the original title of this session was rebuilding infrastructure, and I was like, we don't rebuild anything, we build. You know, we start from zero. I mean, Liberia, where Fanny also worked on, we're proud to say that in the past 5 years we have increased the number of people with access to energy by 10 or 12 times, but we're still at 3% of the population, right? So you start from absolutely zero. Guinea-Bissau, 3 megawatt operational. You start in, you know, I lived in CR for a couple of years, at that time 10 megawatt operational. You start from absolutely zero, which is different than some of the middle income fragile environments. I think the second thing is we increasingly work in fragile regions within countries instead of in fragile states. Think classical example is northern Nigeria. How do you deal with that, and how do you deal with some of the equity issues that Bob referred to? And the third reality we work in is an extreme resource scarcity. Some of these complex, fragile states. Liberia is a donor darling, so there's some money around. CER is an absolute donor orphan. I mean, a lot of the donors have given up. Unit cost in a lot of the fragile states in Africa, and especially the landlocked fragile states for all infrastructure, whether it's water or energy or transport, are not 30% higher. They're 300 or 400% of what you pay elsewhere. So your dollar doesn't go that far. So the choices you make in a resource scarce environment are very, very scarce. So just kind of a different kind of reality slightly than some of the other. In the bank, we always talk about market failure and government failure. And when government fails, we say we'll use a market-based solution. When markets fail, we say, well, we'll use a government-based solution. I think there's a third one in fragile states, which is community failure. In a lot of the countries where we work, communities actually don't work as communities anymore. And it's very painful to see that. But that also means that if you talk about distributed solutions, if the market doesn't work and the community doesn't work, it's a reaction to government failure. But these other failures are also there, so it's very easy to get very depressed about it. But we have to work with markets and governments and communities and build all of that up pretty much from scratch. I wanted to say a little bit about the role of the bank, and I'm going to be a little bit provocative here, because otherwise it's not a fun session, no? I fully agree with the non-sequential nature of what we do. We need to build up institutions from zero, we need to build up markets, we need to build up governments, we need to build up communities, and at the same time we need to provide light to people. We don't only need to provide light to people, we also need to give economic impulse in countries where you can't distribute any wealth if there isn't any wealth. So it's not only about very basic access, it's actually also about getting industries and small and medium enterprise, but even bigger industries, some juice in their industries. What are we good at? I think we're good at infrastructure. We're traditionally an infrastructure bank, and we know how to do large infrastructure. We're good at working with governments. We're a club of governments in the end, for better or for worse. Even some of your clients are not the people you want to work with. We work through governments. I used to work for Doctors Without Borders, and my first mission when I came to the bank was to DRC. And I remember in the first meeting I ever had as a bank staff, I was so appalled which side of the table I had to sit down. I was like, my God, I'm now with these, it was Bemba at the moment, at that time. I'm now with the bad guys. But we have to realize that that's where we come from. And we're good at wholesale, and we're not that good at retail. Our processes are too heavy for small solutions. We're not humanitarians. I used to work with Doctors Without Borders for 5 years with a lot of pleasure, but I think on these kind of refugee solutions, I think we really need to think, is that where we need to play a role? It's very necessary, but I'm not sure we are the best to place. There's much more capacity elsewhere. We're not an NGO, so some of the distributed solutions, etc., and going to the village, etc., I love it, but that's not the role I have, and I'm probably too expensive to do it, and too heavily processed to do it. And I also think this leapfrogging is something that we have to be careful with, no? And we do what we do need to do in these countries, actually, to help government build up a presence, and I think we should not fall in the kind of small is beautiful trap in these countries. We do need national grids if there's nothing, no? I do think we need to actually make our processes work for us. If you're based in a fragile state, I think actually as much a pain as the procurement processes of the bank are, this is an improvement over, just giving the contract to your nephew or to your uncle, etc. And I think this kind of on-the-job training, building institutions through what we're doing is at the core of what we're doing. And I think we shouldn't be afraid to celebrate even our successes on some of the pretty pedestrian progress we made. 2 points two thoughts to wrap up. One is on expertise. Yes, we need expertise. We need the best technical expertise. When I was based in CER, there were 2 expat infrastructure specialists for all transport, water, energy. I think there were about 35 expat DDR, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration experts. That's wrong, right? And I think this audience is also very much a fragility and conflict specialist, and we need that specialization, but don't make the mistake that you don't need engineers, financial analysts, economists, people who know how to do the kind of nuts and bolts. We need the best expertise on these, and we're very often very thin on the ground on those. I think we don't really know that well yet how to work in fragile states on these infrastructure sectors. This idea of equity and trying to reach the most difficult and most vulnerable populations is nice, but we work with governments who might not want to do this. And if you have 1% access to energy in your capital, you really can't convince, go to the end of the countryside. So this kind of balance between having to build up the core kind of constituency of a government vis-à-vis the weaker groups in these very low access countries is a real challenge, and we can't do it all because we don't have enough resources. So we need to know the political economy, we need to know all this fragility stuff. I'm not sure we know how to do good, but we should at least, to use some safeguard language, make sure we do no harm in our infrastructure investments. And infrastructure needs to be informed by fragility considerations, but we cannot solve all the conflict and fragility issues through infrastructure. So I think there's a balance of the possible versus the desirable. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Maaike. Thank you very much to all the panelists. I think we've learned that, yes, we can make a difference in fragile states, but that the needs of people on the ground are not necessarily the same as in other countries, and the approaches and methods we use to provide energy services to people in fragile states are also not necessarily the same ones. I would like to open it up to the audience. If you're interested to make a contribution, there's a microphone in the back, please. And please introduce yourself, your name and...
the panelists for their contributions. My name is Sid Berry. I'm Senior Advisor to the African ED. Maaike, you mentioned the issue of scarcity of resources. I think that's very important. It's a very important aspect of financing infrastructure in FCS. We know that usually infrastructure needs a lot of resources, and in FCS that is exactly what you don't have. And the current bank models for allocating resources to FCS cannot solve that problem either. So my question to you is, how do we pull the needed resources? I mean, a lot of resources to finance this big infrastructure in FCS. Thank you.
It's a key question, and I don't have all the answers. No, let me first give. It was actually interesting. There was this 50-year vision for the bank or something. That presentation that went around, something for insiders that Carl Peters got done. I actually had a laugh because it says, "Oh, there's no public resources in fragile states. Hence, we need to tap private resources," which is again, if government failure, then we go to market failure. We need to try to get in private capital into fragile states, but it's extremely difficult and it makes services extremely expensive. No, we're working on an independent power provider on Sierra Leone and another one on Mali where we only will give a guarantee. But, you looking at equity returns of, 22, 23, 24%, you're looking at guarantee and security packages that are extremely... so yes, we need to crowd in private financing from international investors as well as from local investors. We need to crowd in other donor financing. We need to make sure that in terms of other new money coming up, such as climate financing, etc., that these countries, which are very often very low polluters, are not left out. But in the end, we also need just more IDA. When I look at these countries, I cannot come to another conclusion than that if we're serious about this, we need more concessional financing to really get these countries over the heap. So I think it's very geopolitical to think about how the world thinks about crowding in financing to fragile states, and can we really make a difference with the resources that are there, especially on these lumpy infrastructure investments. I think it's not a full answer, because I think it's one of the most difficult dilemmas we're dealing with, and we need to be efficient with what we have.
Hi, my name is Roxana Capros. I work with thank you, first of all, for all the presentation and the valuable inputs on this topic. So I work on the first P4R energy project that the bank has, is preparing now for Indonesia, but I also work on Yemen and Libya. On building capacity for governments. So one of the things that governments often request us, for assistance, is building their capacity to handle the energy resources in terms of concessions and also infrastructure. So my question is related to the fragility topic. How do you accommodate the need for restoring energy services on the short term? Because this is a thing that you need to do in order to avoid relapsing to conflict. So it is one of the areas that the government needs to provide really quickly, so that keeps the population happy on the long term, on the medium and long term. But how do you accommodate that with the long-term capacity building in terms of infrastructure for government? Because in cases like Libya, first of all, the government needs to take over all these, the energy resources that are handled by militias, and build their own infrastructure, build their own capacity, train their own people in the ministries and in the local institutions that handle these energy resources, and that takes a lot of time, right? But how, maybe drawing upon your some of the best practices, how it's best to address this topic, to accommodate the two aspects? Thank you.
You take it. Yeah. That's a really tough one.
I can talk a little bit. Firstly, I think we have to pose that question to the clients whom we're serving, the government, if there's different factions we're working with, the people, whatever access we have on that, right? Because, and I go back to the point that I made about you have to balance the sequential part of institution building, then delivering the service versus getting what needs to be done. So I think that's the first step, is to ask them, and they, I think, often will know, well, okay, well, look, we actually have to get power going in this part, or we have to do this, or this particular power plant. I'm the only no, I guess you're not either. They put us non-engineers at the end down here, so I don't have the technical solution. But that this power plant can get up nice and quick, or this is going to take much longer, or something. And so you can listen to them and to see what do they think can happen on that, right? Secondly is then seeing how quickly you actually can do some of these things, right? And I think you go back to some of the internal mechanisms that we have, what development partners have, is what we can do is bring them some of the analysis and capacity of realistically what you can get up and running more quickly, right? But I would certainly agree with you that you have to balance these two, and I would think that in those initial days, initial years, balancing on the side of getting some short-term gains, getting the service delivery up and running is going to take priority. The longer-term capacity building, that need is always going to be there, and the emphasis is on the long term. And the final point I would say is looking for innovative solutions on whether it's on independent power producers, you've got a public-private partnership. Are there turnkey operations? I would look to the technical people on this, but are there different ways that you can show some short-term gains that will bring in the power, right? It may not be the best long-term solution, but what it does is it buy the government and the people a little bit of time to figure out how they want to do capacity going forward.
Yeah, I think it's a false dichotomy, no? Capacity building versus doing projects and service delivery. And it depends if you are in a country where you have quite high capacity and you have a conflict that kind of destroys physical infrastructure, but you still have that human capacity and institutional capacity to build on. When I came to CER, most ministries did not have any staff that had ever done a project. Right? So you start from zero. So what you do for capacity building is you actually start working. You start working on service delivery so that people start realizing what is it to procure a contract, what is it to organize a tariff, what is it to... So I don't think that dichotomy is there. I actually think, especially in these very weak environments, the on-the-job training is really where this comes from. So by doing service delivery and by not sequencing it, you build up institution and you build up human capacity.
So I guess the conclusion is try and do both. Do we have more questions? Sandy.
So I have a couple of comments and then a question sort of related to that. I mean, first of all, introducing myself, I'm Sandeep Kohli, work in energy and extractives, South Asia. Many years ago, when kind of I looked at the first power plant and a first IPP, the thing that occurred to me is whoever is the private entity that's going to put money into this power plant and expect to be paid over 20 years, 25 years, there is one strong underlying assumption, and that is that this country where he's putting this plant is going to do well. Because there is no way the revenue stream that he's about to get or he's signing on to get can be de-linked from that economy. You can do that in oil and gas, in oil more than in gas potentially, because you take the resource and it is an internationally traded commodity. But when you talk about electricity, you are intrinsically linked to the economy where you are. And I think today's topic, where we are talking about fragile economies, the question I really want to ask is, what is the long-term assumption that we are making? In other words, if we are making the assumption that these fragile economies are on the path to being mended and are on a path where the trajectory is upwards, then yes, we can talk about IPPs, we can talk about private investment, and we can shore it up with guarantee structures and other things. But if we are talking about countries where we don't believe things are going to be on the mend, we're in the middle of a war zone, and or there is just so much overwhelming uncertainty around, it is almost impossible to envisage why someone from the private sector would come in and put money in, even when it is shored up with lots of guarantees and things. So, my comment is, yes, I agree, in a lot of these places, you have to look at IDA, and you potentially have to look at structures that are, frankly, going to be transitory. But I just wanted to get sort of your feedback and comment on that.
She's put me on the spot. It's. I think typically we always believe that our countries are on the up and going forward, and we don't often ask that question. And I suspect that it will be the countries that are on the border, like the households that are on the border of the poverty line, they're the ones we need to worry about most, not the ones that are clearly poor and the ones that are clearly not poor, but the ones that are in the middle. It may be the countries that are on that border that are not on Chaz's list, but that were a few years ago. They may be the ones where we need to ask that question more explicitly. I mean, I suspect that the conflict countries, we have implicitly made that decision that we think they're on the up. That's why we're there. But the ones that we've said, you know, you've graduated from being fragile, and they could fall back into being fragile. That's where we need to actually perhaps ask that question more explicitly. I can think of a few, but I'm not going to name them here.
Yeah, the other thing we need to look at is countries which are horrible at a country level, but have functioning sectors, no? Whether it's the water sector or the energy sector. I mean, for instance, if you look at Niger, Niger crosses all the boxes, no? I mean, in terms of fragility. They don't have a high energy access, but they actually have a reasonable capacity to manage their energy sector. So what is Niger, where does that come from, and how can we kind of isolate, no? And you cannot build ivory towers in the middle of a swamp, but in how far can we replicate some of that as well, or in how far are we just bound by the pace of progress in general? And it's interesting, I mean, if you look at Africa, the Sahel countries actually in general are quite good at managing their resources because they're so desperate for managing them, and some of the more resource-rich countries seem to be less good at it, is at least something that I non-academically have. But what's different, no? I mean, what are these cases?
Just one point to add on that is I think when you are talking about private sector involvement, they're the ones who will make those assumptions. They are the ones who will make those decisions. It's not us, right? Take the example of Afghanistan. We and others have been involved in Afghanistan now since 2002. Yet here in 2016 is the first time that there's going to be movement on an independent power producer with the IFC, the bank, the government, and others being involved. And USAID is also working well. So it's taken 14 years in a country that has had billions and billions and billions of dollars of investments and very high growth rates to even get to this point, right? But ultimately, it's the private sector who decides that, as you said, with the right financial structure, with the guarantees and what have you around that, that they feel comfortable going into that.
Thanks. Please.
Hi, I'm Atal Ahmadzai, and actually I work in Afghanistan. I'm from Afghanistan, and my research area now is on looking at the nexus of development, conflict, and energy in South Asia. So what Mr. Cooley said, just a comment on that, that actually energy in the producing energy or infrastructure for energy is really a tightrope walk, not just for fragile states, but also for stable states. What happened between India and Pakistan over the Indus River Treaty, actually those two countries, they couldn't manage to solve their issue unless an international organization or a third country jumped in and created a conciliation or an agreement, despite the fact that they had an agreement on that water. So this is really like whenever we're talking about infrastructure of hydropower or for energy, either at national levels or at grassroots level, an integrated part is conflicts. So even like if we look at it at subnational level in Afghanistan, so it's not just creating energy for villages. It creates conflicts because it is the issue of water rights. It is the issue of land usage rights, in which really instigate new conflicts or give new dimensions to an existing conflict. While we're moving upward to the state level, the same dynamic exists. Afghanistan is somehow like having somehow relatively well per capita availability of water, but it is not able to use it as water because of the political economy of the water. So if World Bank or some other organization want to invest on infrastructure in Afghanistan, first they have to solve the political economy's problems with the neighbors. Afghanistan is not having any agreement with its neighbors. So my question, specific question is that how this nexus of water in infrastructure for hydro power can be solved. I mean, whenever we are talking of hydropower, creating hydropower for infrastructure, there is the question of conflicts, either strengthening the existing conflict or creating new conflict. So what an international organization like World Bank can do in this regard? Thank you. And by the way, I know Caitlin. Hi.
Maybe let's ask what she thinks we should be doing as and we can then ask some of our experts to contribute.
As the token outsider. I mean, I think that it's a problem you see everywhere. I mean, I lived in Syria before it was a mess, and it was a problem very much you saw in Syria at the time. You know, it was a relatively stable state, but, you know, conflicts with Turkey over water rights. I mean, you just see this kind of thing everywhere, I agree. I think it gets tricky, right? Because if you're engaging with governments, do you tie this in as part of kind of the requirements for, you know, kind of your aid? You say, hey, look, and you've got to play ball with your neighbors here, especially if we're going to be doing these big projects. Do you make promises with a certain government? Do you have a regime change in some capacity, and then all of that goes to nothing? So I think, again, we're at that kind of how do you think long term about sort of big, especially big infrastructure projects like hydropower, and who you're making arrangements with. So I think that, you know, it's how do you get those kinds of guarantees? Do you require those guarantees? Do you require vague promises instead of guarantees? And how does that begin to work? And how do you think about that in the sort of the long term for these big projects?
I think just a couple ideas on that. Number one, and these are very practical, is that you have to have opportunity for people to continue talking. And so one of the things that we do in Afghanistan is we have a range of activities, whether it's domestically within the country, because you're right, Afghanistan has an excess of water, right? But harnessing it to use it, they don't have yet fully developed. So whether it's on irrigation or on agriculture, you have avenues from community development councils, from the irrigation committees, what have you, so that people are talking. And the same thing internationally. So for example, with Pakistan, we have several venues under the Indus River Treaty work and other venues where they talk. And so it sounds very simple, but it matters, right? The second is the building blocks approach. And what we're doing as well in Afghanistan and in the work with Pakistan is rather than going for, look, we got to solve the whole riparian issues all at once, we're working on one hydro dam. We have required notification. We got Pakistan, Christina and Fanny did all this. I don't know why I'm describing it. But where you solve one little piece, right? And it gets you to a step forward, and it's a step in the right direction. And then you keep doing these building blocks. Now, then, for example, in Afghanistan, where they do have a treaty, long-standing treaty with Iran on the Helmand River, I know that they're trying to open up and have discussions about that. And then with the Amudarya up north and things. So two very practical things. Keep finding venues and opportunities to talk at varying levels. And number two is recognize that you can use building blocks. You don't need the complete solution all at once.
Yeah, I mean, what I would call sectoral diplomacy, I think, is where the bank comes in very, very strongly. No, and the Indus Treaty is one of the oldest examples of this, but very often without giving it much visibility. We do this in so many places, no, and very often centered around water and around hydropower, but also around other energy projects, no. I mean, Mauritania has gas reserves that it's too small to do LNG exports. So you can only develop it for electricity production, but it's too big for only the Mauritanian export. So for the past 8 years, we've worked with Mauritania, Senegal, and Mali on seeing how these gas resources can be developed and power plants can be built with exports to other countries. That's a tremendous amount through our CDs, through our sector specialists, through, I mean, the WAP-CLSG line. The interconnection between Cote d'Ivoire, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea is another example. And I see this, I mean, it's very easy to talk, and I mean, in the newspaper you have, oh, water a source of conflict, of energy a source of conflict. These are the building blocks and the entry points that actually make people talk. So it's the entry point to get better service, but also an entry point to actually collaborate between states.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? I think we have time for one more question, maybe. Please.
Quick question. So, given that we work across practices, and some of the practices, especially on the social protection poverty side, are more connected to the communities than we are, and given that these blocks within the governments are also closer to the communities than we are, what's the panel's assessment of our ability to leverage these relations that we have with the governments? What have we done right? Where do we go wrong?
He knows I've got bloody fingers from trying to deal with this kind of thing. I think technocrats and engineers do certain things very well, and they see the right answer and the obvious solution, which may very well not be what the community sees, and they may well not see the community's perspective at all. And the community may want a completely different set of things, which wouldn't even have crossed our minds. And I think we don't do as good a job as we could do. I think that will be a new frontier for us going forward, as both for us and our clients, particularly actually our clients, of finding not only what you say, but how you say it, how you approach people, how you go in there, recognizing your implicit power even when you don't think you have power, recognizing how the community will see you, and the kind of basic respect of giving them 3 days notice and of staying more than an hour. And I mean, it all sounds really obvious when I say it now, but we don't always do it, and our clients certainly don't always do it. When I joined the World Bank, the social community people and the environment people were in the S building. I think I've told you this. They were in the S building, and we used to call it the S for Sideline building. And they were unempowered. I mean, you were there. I was there. We were all there. They were unempowered people within the organization because the macro guys ran it all. And I think in our clients, the community engagement people are in the S for Sideline building. They're somewhere off, and they don't feel empowered, and they don't feel strong, and they don't have necessarily the support of their management. And I think what you see in more advanced agencies, like the India power line company, the CEO of that tells us that he spends 75% of his time on community engagement, whereas in the less, whatever the word is, the less sophisticated clients where we work, they wouldn't even think of that because their job is to do the engineering, right? And I think that's an area where we neglect that at our peril, and our own tendencies go against that because that's not what we've been trained to do either. So I think that's a kind of learning that we have to kind of force, a habit, a mental model that we have to force ourselves into going forward.
Apologies to those not from the World Bank, because this is an internal World Bank issue, but then this is where my role comes in. And those are my colleagues in the country management unit. So as a country director, that's my job, is to tell Julia and Fanny when I'm having a meeting, well, Nyla, who was just here, she just had to leave early, who does National Solidarity Program, or Richard Hogg, who is here, who's our program leader on service delivery, they need to be in the meeting. And we do that. In Afghanistan, we've had 14 years of success on that working together. To me, is a simple question of supply and demand. So we demand that, and we expect the work to be done that way, and you can make it happen. And then the same with government.
Does that answer your question? Well, thank you very much, everyone. Unless there is one more burning question. Any more burning questions? Let's give the panel a round of applause and appreciation for their time. Thank you very much for coming. I think the panel has shown that indeed, an engagement is needed, but that the traditional solutions don't apply. I think all the panel members have very ably been explaining to us is that there are avenues of a new paradigm and new methods and methodologies that could be targeted to fragile states for energy interventions, and that solutions across fragile states may be quite similar for energy. So on that note, again, big thanks to the audience also for the great interaction, and have a good ongoing Fragility Forum.
And thanks to Fanny for getting energy on the agenda of the forum. So thank you.